Hello, everybody, and welcome to Rocket Lasso Live, a special episode. I believe we'd be on episode 30, but today is the Slicer launch party. How is everybody doing? I see we have a disproportionate amount of people on YouTube, which is cool. Welcome, everybody. With Dan, Kyle, Firewire, Caspian, Andrew. How's it going, everybody? Wayne. And then over on Twitch, we got people hanging out too. Matt Dog, Rogue, Bralius, Dean, Tobias, Scott, Peer, Ancient Hippo, welcome. Monthys, Burned, welcome. Chris, Crossfader, and more popping in every second. Sarah, Diafel, welcome. Vincent, Jake, Clarky. Hi, so many people coming and hanging out. I hope everybody's doing well. We've got a bunch to cover today. Now, the focus of today's stream is going to be talking about the brand new plugin that we have launched over here at Rocket Lasso called Slicer. It is the third in the trio of generator plugins that we've been working on, although we do have another pack coming out, but this was the boom, boom, boom getting them out. So the next one will be a little ways away, but not too far. So I hope everyone is doing well. It's going to be a Q&A about Slicer, but I've got some demos to walk through. I just played the commercial. Anyway, we've got a bunch to cover. Very excited to have gotten this plugin out. We were working on this for a while. We started work on this plugin probably like 2.5 years ago, and we had other things to focus on a bit. So we had to like shift things around, and it ended up getting bumped back behind other plugins. And we've got a bunch of other plugins in the works as well, but we've got a bunch of them to a state where they're getting close to launch. So that is where we are at. Having done all of that, why don't we jump in and start looking at some things? So here's the basic info page. You can head on over there. I put a link already there in the chat. But if you scroll through, we've got some descriptions, the commercial. Here's a bunch of GIFs explaining some of the functionality and interface breakdowns. And then here's the quick start. And if you haven't gotten the chance to watch the quick start, we're going to go over some similar projects here, but that's a good way of seeing the practical way of doing it. Meanwhile, there's the training series, which goes to YouTube. And this training series is a playlist that walks through like all the different features. So I highly recommend checking out these videos so you actually know exactly what's going on behind every button press. Back into Cinema. Boop. So here we are in Cinema 4D, S24, and I've docked all of the icons. So here is the brand new Slicer, and there's Mesh the Spline from a couple weeks ago, and there's Ricochet from about 2 months ago, and here's a little preview of some of the utility splines that we're going to be launching soon. We talked about some of those last time. Maybe we'll have a use for them today, maybe not, I don't know. All right. So, and if anybody has any questions or anything, feel free to throw it out. I'm going to be checking them out. CG Sophie, yeah, save any kind of random cinema questions for next week, but today will all be about Slicer. So if you have any questions about that, feel free to put them in the chat. Oh, Evolve saying that sucks. We are supporting all the way back to R20, but not back to 19. Too many things changed between 19 and 20 for us to support that far back. So, let me do some basic demos. To begin with, the most basic, obvious thing to do, and it's just, we get questions all the time in Rocket Lasso Live, and even in the older days in Ask GSG, where we'd have something like a landscape, and there was just some cool animations that people made about getting a bunch of different kind of stepped effects going on this. So now, go to your extensions dropdown or plugins dropdown, depending on your version, and opening up a Rocket Slicer. The rocket is typically silent. And now we can take the landscape and drop it as a child and then select Slicer. I'm going to change the axis to the bottom so we can see a bunch of cuts. And now you can see we are chopping along the geometry. Couple quick things to note immediately. One, we've got this handy widget set up. So you can see we've got the bottommost line, the topmost line, subdivisions for where every cut is going to be, the up direction, and we've even got this handy handle right here for pulling up and down and changing your scale if you want to right there in the viewport, always handy. Then grabbing our slices, we can change the count here and make as many or as few as we like. Then the entire thing, well, right now it's a parent, but we have an auto scale button, which is pretty neat. Actually, before I talk about auto scale, we've also got our orientation. So we can change the direction of this. So I could say chop it on Z plus, X plus, any of those. But we also have this object Z plus. So if we create that, it's going to create a empty space, a link field, and we can click create to make a null. And now that null becomes the pivot point for the slicer. So we can rotate that around and place it however we like. Let's 0 that out and go to 90 because we're pointed up on Z. So now I'm able to place that wherever I want. And now you see that this way it doesn't affect the child. The landscape isn't moving, so this can move around automatically. So having explained what that null does, let's put that back to regular Z plus, or I'm sorry, Y plus. And then check out, we've got this auto scale button. So if you click auto scale, it'll automatically set it to that null and then exactly perfectly place this on the bottommost point and the topmost point and make as many cuts as you like. So having done that, oh yeah, and then you can keep on updating that. So let's say we went and rotate this to some crazy angle. Now, again, you see that our widget is showing that, hey, it ends pretty early. But if we go back to the slicer and say auto scale again, it'll again perfectly match the length given the current orientation. So you can constantly update that to whatever direction you want it to be. So another super basic function that we built in. Well, here's an important thing. When we began this process, this was purely a spline tool. Like we've been working on a whole series of spline tools. So it's okay, spline tools. But then as we kept going, we decided to start adding in a little bit of geometry. So we have this geometry tab. And to start out with, we had just made this flat option. Turning on SSAO, you can see how we've got some separation between these layers. And we're like, okay, cool, we're just going to do that. This is returning a nice clean n-gon of geometry. And this is just working fine. And then, especially with the beta testers, and even as I used it more, it's like, oh, it'd be really great to get some thickness on here. So then we ended up making the extrude, and then we ended up adding in bevel, and then we eventually made this landscape mode that we'll talk about more in a little bit. But anyway, here is the extrude. I would like to, well, here's the thickness of the extrude. We can set it to anything. Very handy though, we have percentage. So clicking percentage, I can now set this to 100%, and now it's eating up exactly the spacing between every single one of those layers, which can be pretty handy. And then we've got a bevel, so we can drag this up and get a bevel automatically applying throughout. Then set your segments up, so we can say 3 segments and round those out. We've tried to simplify things a bit, so this doesn't have like every option that the Cinema Extrude has, but we've got the basic ones in there. Oh, here's something that's handy. If you've been using extrudes for a while, then it's always a pain when you're using an extrude because you're like, oh, I want to add some bevel, but then it makes your object taller. Well, we didn't do that. We made it so that it just eats into the existing length. So as we added in the extra size, you can see how it's just showing it from the side. And it doesn't overshoot into additional layers. So hitting N and B to see our polygon count. I'll get rid of the bevel for a moment, and let's take a look at a couple of handy settings that we built in. So one is inside the main tab. You can see how this is just cutting across the object. You just get what you get. And, you know, depending on the way you're cutting, you're going to see that, hey, some of these points are really close to each other and other ones are really far apart. Like, look how close that one is. And that ends up having these really sharp areas all over the place. You just never quite know what the geometry is going to look like. And especially once you have a bevel of some sort, like that can mess up the way the bevels look a bit. So we added in a smooth. So this is actually the smooth from the upcoming smooth tool built directly in as a simplified version. But this is going to take every single point on a given spline and then look at the neighbors and average them out through an iteration. So I can give it one iteration, and even one iteration, look how much smoother that starts looking. So I'm going to increase that again and again and again, and you can see how smooth these lines all start looking as they just kind of blend between each other. So right there, really handy thing, because if you just chop a mesh as you go up, then it's going to look really harsh like this. So very handy along those lines. Then we've got I'm going to turn off the geometry for a moment. And the next setting we could tinker around with would be our expand. So we can grab expand and we can push this to be larger away from the landscape. I'm going to make a duplicate of landscape so we can see the original. And by expanding, you see I can push that away from the surface, or we could even go negative and into the surface. So, and then that, you know, calculates before the smooth. So you could expand outward and then also smooth a bit and let those get rounded out. And now that this is a spline, we could do whatever we like with it. Let's feed that into a sweep. And then into that sweep, I'll feed a rectangle, which is huge, but let's set that down to 2 by 2 and then start making it taller so we can get these overlapping waves. So now you can see, okay, cool, we've got all these overlapping waves. This outer layer is going to be getting a little messed up because we have to turn off this remove redundant points. That was removing these straight edges, but let's keep those straight edges. So we've kind of got this landscape going, but if you go into the main tab, there are additional settings. We want to keep this as simple and clean as possible, but there's additional settings. If you twirl down spread, inside of there, we've got extra settings. So you could do things like variation, which is going to add random spacing between each of the layers, which you'll be able to tell better if I make that not quite as tall. So you can see we're getting random distance between these different layers, so just a bit of variation. We have a random seed to be able to cycle through those. And then, yeah, we've got our spacing offset. Oh, yeah, well, spacing's the next one I want to talk about. So let's put this back to being taller. And then under this slicer, we can go to spacing, no variation, spacing, and say, actually, I want 0 spacing. And it's now collapsed all of those layers down to the exact same level. So right out of the gate, I think that's a really powerful addition to be able to actually turn this into a kind of topographical map. And we'll see more use cases of this later on. Putting that back to a regular spacing, the next setting to talk about is probably rate. We've got this automatic animation set up, so we hit play. You see these layers are going to be traveling along the current orientation, so along Y+, all traveling straight up, doing a nice clean cut. But then if we start collapsing the spacing all the way down, those are still traveling upward, but their result is shown on the bottom, so it just looks like they're traveling through here. So it's a really fun way of getting these kind of crazy cuts going through it. So let me check the chat and see if there's direct questions. Justin, I'm gonna maybe save that question for another time. Like, yeah, you could make some stacks of paper. I'd have to think about that. That's a good question. Let's save that for next week. Definitely hit me there. Could they be quack reject? A way to connect them to make a ribbon or spiral? Not a direct way, because there's no, I think the idea would be, I think what you're asking is like, could one layer jump to the next one? But it more would go to how would that even happen? Like, there's no direct relationship between one layer and the next. So automatically making that connection, I can't even really think of how I'd go about doing that. Interesting idea though, I'll keep it in mind. So, okay, let's move into a different scene file. What do we got? I'm gonna open up this one. So this is I mean, here's a character model. It's not a good model. What I did is I just used the volume builder and I built it off of the mannequin that comes with the Cinema 4D motion capture data. Speaking of the motion capture data, why don't we put some animation onto this character? So I'm going to go to the asset browser, and if you're in the newer version of Cinema, then you should have access to this. And inside we have our motion capture folder. Inside of there is a bunch of different motion captures, which just recently got reorganized, and I think new ones got added in. So we've got entire categories here. So I want something where they're just standing there. So we'll go to the cheering, but let's get a different one than usual. There's a sway. I'll grab this one. So now we've got a cheering animation. And just for a quick cinema rigging lesson, this is an animation setup. If I play, you can see we've got this character moving around doing its thing. Then I've got a character exactly the same scale as that skeleton. If I select this character definition tag, there is a reset reference pose button, which will put it back in its T-pose. Now that that's happened, I can select this entire hierarchy, which if I select any one, you can see it's got like all these keyframes. It's also 130 frames long, so we'll crop it to that. Okay, so let me reset the pose. And then middle mouse button click the topmost joint, which will select the entire hierarchy automatically. Then also select the character, and now I can say character bind, and that's all you gotta do. It has now created a skin tag, a joint weight tag, where it's binding all of those, and those have become weighted to this animation. So if I hit play, now this mesh is going to be doing it. Now there is, it's not as showing up as much in this animation as another one, but you see the shoulder gets a bit messed up here. So there's another new tool in Cinema called Delta Mush, and if you drop that after the skin deformer, this deformer can run a bunch of iterations and start cleaning up that kind of mesh. You see around the shoulder how much nicer that deformation is. So I'm just going to put a bunch of that in there just to clean that up. So yeah, now we've got this character doing its thing, and we've got some animation. So with this model here, we can pull in a slicer. So click a slicer, pull it down. Now, before we were making the landscape a child of the slicer, but with the same workflow we've been building into all of our tools, we've got this source geometry tab. And instead of feeding in a child, I'm going to feed in objects. And so now it's a list of objects, which means I can remote into this character. Now that we're remoting into that character, I could do things like, let's say that we should pivot from the bottom. We get all these cuts, then make as many slices as I like. We could say, hey, don't calculate this character, turn that off. We can click this eyeball and that will turn off the stoplights on the character. So now we don't see it, or we can bring it back again very easily. And that, yeah, there's the super basics on putting that there. Hitting play, we've got the character animated. It's going to escape a little bit, so I'm going to, oops, don't draw spline. I'm going to pull that up a little bit extra just to make sure I'm catching every part of the character. And yeah, now we've got those cuts. Now, as we mentioned, we could always take this and rotate it to some other angle. Move this over here, stretch that up a bit more. Then let's hide the character. And, you know, we could add variation on here. Let's add some rate on, let those start traveling through the character. Go to geometry and hit flat. And now the geometry is going to be generated, traveling across. Now, a couple of important things to note. If you're going to be using these geometry modes, essentially internally we're using a Cinema 4D Extrude, but we're using it in a very specific way. We're trying to do a bunch of things to get around the way the extrude works. And I don't know how much I should get into it right now, but the Cinema 4D Extrude object doesn't like these very advanced splines. And yeah, let's spend a second talking about it because I think it's important. Where these aren't really limitations. It's just something to keep in mind, and then the way we got around them. So let's go back to sort of a default here, and I shall remote link into an object being the landscape. We'll hide it. Okay, so you can see we got all these splines here. Now let's cut back on the number of cuts. If I were to take this spline, and right now it is a spline object, so if I make it editable, you're going to see that it is just a single spline with a bunch of different segments. So let's say we took that spline and we want to feed it into an extrude. I don't want it to be on auto, so I'll set it to Y+, and let's just go up by 25 units. And what's it doing? Why does it look like this? Why is it interconnecting every other layer and kind of doing this weird transition? Well, my assumption is, I don't know this for a fact, but it's that the most complex spline that would ever really get fed to an extrude was something like a text object. So if I were to make some text here, let's lay it flat on the ground. Kind of no matter what you type in here, I mean, any crazy characters, the most complex it's ever going to get is one spline segment inside of another. That's as complex as it gets. And there's an algorithm that the extrude is probably running that is detecting if a spline is inside of another spline. And these are all, keep in mind that these are all flat. These are completely, it's a completely flat spline. So if it's saying, okay, well, here's the outer spline, connect that to the inner one, well, that's pretty much exactly what's happening here. It is taking the outer spline and connecting it to the inner one. But then it's like, oh, wait, but there's another hole. So alternate and then do it again, and alternate and do it again, alternate and do it again. So that's the calculation that it's doing. So even making the spline, that can be a limitation to it. So what we're doing internally is actually taking all of those splines and offsetting them in space. So we're almost making like a giant grid of them. And then we're letting a single extrude, and then moving them back into position again after that calculation has happened. So we're doing a lot of compensating. Having said that, you can go into the slicer and say, don't return a single spline. Right now it's returning a spline that's closed and there's no segments. If I say explode layer, though, now if I make my slicer editable, it's actually returning a null and a series of splines. And the extrude is smart enough to be able to see this type of thing. So now that we're returning multiple objects, I can turn the extrude back on again, and you'll see only the topmost one is getting extruded. But we can say, hey, extrude, see the entire hierarchy. And internally, this is returning a null and a bunch of splines, but the extrude can even see inside of it, even though right now it hasn't been made editable. So now you can see it does return every single layer. Important thing to note, as a general rule, Cinema 4D doesn't like a lot of objects, and this is actually returning a lot of objects. If I make this extrude editable, you're going to see it's actually made up of a series of different extrudes, each one with a different spline and potentially different caps. So yeah, keep that in mind. You can definitely simplify. So we simplify that internally so that all of that isn't happening. But anyway, you can return this as an extrude. And if you do return it as an extrude, then you could always go in and start doing some more advanced options inside of Cinema, like changing the cap type to Delaney and get all these subdivisions if you needed to by feeding that into extrude. It does totally work. Okay, cool. Back to the character. So yeah, we've got all these slices going, and we can go into our geometry tab, and we could extrude those out. And you can see that they're going to extrude on the current direction. Set that to be on the percentage. Important thing to note, the variation, the percentage doesn't look at the variation. So these are pretty absolute on the overall size. We could always add in that bevel, get those looking all crazy. And yeah, you can create so many different looks with the character here. An entirely different category of things to keep in mind while we're talking about it is the Cinema 4D Extrude does not like when splines overlap each other. And if you get overlapping splines, you can get some pretty crazy geometry. So let me show you. These don't count because those are separate segments. But if I go and I start adding a bunch of expand on here, you're going to start seeing like some bad geometry sometimes. And that's because the singular spline is crisscrossing over itself because it's expanding. The line crisscrosses and then it's going to explode. So just another thing that the extrude does. But if you go easy on the expand, and usually smooth can actually clean that geometry up as well. Just keep that in mind. Anyway, I haven't really done much with this file, but Stracknell actually was doing some animations on Twitter, and they're really cool. So I went and downloaded from, let me get the web page because I want to make sure to give proper credit. So I downloaded one of these free VDBs from Django FX from Embergen, and I brought it into Cinema. And what you do is you load it as a volume just by opening it, and you get this crazy explosion going. And you can feed that into a volume builder, give it your resolution. So I'm actually expanding it and smoothing it, and then you can build that into a volume. And let me go to a different frame, and you can see it'll actually create geometry for you. So I went through and did that, and then baked it out as Alembic, just so we can get it running really quickly. So now we've got this geometry, and we get a fun little explosion going. So yeah, you've been able to do that in Cinema for a while, and yeah, there's definitely some free VDBs out there. So I haven't actually played with this too much, but I thought this would maybe make for something fun to try and play around with. Creating a slicer, we can move this down, and I do like remote linking into objects, so I will do that. Now it's cutting. Let's chop from the bottom, create as many cuts as we like, make it a little bit taller, hide the original object. Maybe it's going to expand, and let's just see how that looks. Boom, very nice. You'll see that the slicer actually runs pretty quick. I'm gonna hit Alt-V and add in the frames per second. So you right here, you can see we're running at, about 30 frames per second for all of that geometry. So, keep in mind all of the geometry that's currently looking at. So splines can run pretty well, but once you extrude it, then geometry will obviously slow down in the viewport. So as soon as I go and activate the flat, you can see that it is now taking a little bit longer for that to calculate. And every time we add more geometry, that will take longer. Turning on some SSAO, and I would like to show geometry only. But anyway, yeah, we get this nice explosion going. Let's say that we want it to be extruded and percentage based. So now it's filling up the entire space. Very nice. And we actually have a mirror of the parameters down here. So that's looking pretty neat. But if we add even one layer smooth, you see how all those harsh edges go away? Like, look at these tight pinches, and the Fong's not going to help. The Fong should already be smoothing those out. But adding in one layer smooth, you'll see the geometry here. You see how pinched those are, but add in even one layer smooth, and it's going to really calm those down. So yeah, now we've got some extruded geometry here, so that explosion can travel up through. Oh, that's so cool. Yeah, I should have totally played around with something like this for the commercial, because that's pretty neat. Then we've got, yeah, we could, of course, put a bevel on there. Here's some additional things on the bevel that are neat. Because we're in percentage, I can just drag that up to any length. So you can see that's going to eat up the entire overall length, giving a fairly unique look. But we can also turn off, say, the start bevel, and now the bevel's only on the top, and now the top bevel will eat up 51% of it. So we could say, hey, eat up 100% of it, and now that's going to calculate from the top to the bottom. So very easy to tweak the looks and make some crazy effects on that overall. Getting rid of the bevel, we could even turn off the start cap and the end cap, and now you get these rings traveling around the outside. So now we just have these final ones without caps, which, because there's less geometry, that will run quicker. And oh, that's very neat. If we wanted to make those fully like ribbons, we could feed the slicer into a Cinema 4D cloth surface, turn off subdivisions, and we'll add in a thickness of 2. And yeah, get these nice rings going on top of it. Yeah, that runs nice and quick. Very neat. Man, there's a lot of fun to be had here. I can't wait to keep on exploring because there's so many possibilities. And I mean, as we keep going, the ability to combine ricochet and mesh the spline and slicer, there's going to be a lot of combinations. So let me go and check on any comments that we might have or questions. Let's see. Yep. Can you add a feature for smoothing the splines based on point proximity rather than smoothing the overall shape? I'm not entirely sure what you mean there, but Intelligent Machine is asking about adding a smoothing for splines based on point proximity rather than smoothing them all. I think I know what you mean. There's actually, as we keep going and we start making more tools, you will see additional things. But as a quick, here's another bonus, just because we had the question. Let's do a little bonus. What did I just do? Oh, pull it out of there. Oh yeah, okay, pull that out and return as a spline. So you're asking about smoothing out a line. So let's just do this again from scratch. Let's feed in the volume mesher and go from the bottom. I think I might have turned off. Oh, I said geometry only, so it's hiding the spline. I was like, what's going on there? Let's add in a bunch of cuts, and we are currently slicing this geometry. So you can see we're getting a cut on every single spot here. Now, the upcoming tool, we did build in this smooth right now, but if we ignore that for a moment, we could take these splines. Actually, let me simplify to show this. Okay, so I'm doing one cut. This is just one cut overall. So here is the upcoming tool. So once again, here's a sneak preview. This is Rocket Smooth, and it's a utility spline. And this spline is expecting you to feed in other splines. So if I feed in Rocket Slicer into Smooth, instantly you see those lines are getting smoothed out. Now, in this specialized tool for smoothing things out, I can turn these tick marks on, and I can see that there is a preview of exactly where all the different splines are being placed. And here, like essentially this iteration, we took that iteration, put into Slicer directly, but now you can see as I add iterations that they're slightly smoothing out and pulling away. But what you're asking is, could it be proximity based? That's actually really specific. I don't even think that would be necessary. And once you're in things like this utility spline suite, then you're going to be able to do alternatives like, right now we're sourcing the points as the entire line, but you're going to be able to say, actually, I'd like to base it off of a certain amount of steps. So now I've said that there is 5 units between every step here. So now we've essentially cleaned that up merely by changing that to a different step type. So now none of them are directly on top of each other because everything's set to exactly 5. In addition to that, you could set this distance to something smaller, let's say 2, so they're all very even. But then when I do one iteration, it's not going to smooth them out that much. And if we keep on increasing the count, then any given iteration of smooth is going to do less. But now I could do several and it doesn't change that much. Having said that, we also have, as we add iterations, there's also this counter scale slider. So you're gonna be able to, counter animate that to make it a little bit larger and match the original shape a little bit more, just to make sure it doesn't, blend completely away. But yeah, just a tiny little preview of that upcoming thing. So yeah, there's gonna be a lot more to show there, but yeah, we've got a bunch of different modes for interpreting splines. Let us open up. Let's actually do some stuff with text. I mean, there's a lot of things to tackle with text and cinema in general. I think pretty often we're working with text, but let's open up a brand new text object. In older versions of cinema, this is just the mode text, but it's been renamed and put into the model area. So I'm going to open up something nice and clean. Maybe we'll just grab a Futurable. That'll work. So some super basic things that we can do out of the box. Create a slicer and remote link in. The reason I usually remote link into the object is because I like being able to freely move the slicer around. I like being able to just take it and move it. And if you make it a child, well, it's going to move with it. So here we're free to move that around. So creating a bunch more slices. Of course, we've already talked about a bunch of the basic features where we could, well, expand out. That works really well on something like text. And then we've got the rate. And I'm going to put fewer slices so we can see this really cleanly. So you can see those moving up and down, well, specifically up. And we could give that some variation in the rate, do some more cuts, let those be traveling upward. It's going to run really quickly here. Now that we don't have a million polygons, like you can see that the frame rate really here is really, really good. So if I take my slicer and tilt it forward, here's something like that. So you can get this, look at this weird optical illusion you can get. So let me hide. So here's our widget. That's preview cuts. We can turn that off. So now we're just seeing this. Look at this object is not moving. It's just sitting there. But you see how it feels like it's moving forward? It's a really, I love this optical illusion. Just by tilting it a few degrees, everything feels like it's moving towards us, but it'll never get to us. But anyway, I want to talk about a couple of options we have. First of all, let's talk about matrix mode. So resetting this back to default, I'm going to hit reset transform and let those be traveling upward. So there's something called matrix mode. Right now we are creating our own slices and we're using our own spread and we're doing all these different details, but we can click this create matrix mode. Something I want to show you is if I turn on the preview cuts, let's get rid of variation as well. Do you see how we're ending up here, starting down here, and we've got cut all the way up? If I click create matrix, that will automatically create a matrix for us, and it's got the exact count and the exact number of cuts that we had originally made. The matrix is a little large in this case, so I'm going to set that down to 0.2, 0.2, 0.2. And you can see that exactly where every single matrix clone is where the cut is existing. So we can now take that matrix and move it around or tilt it. And wherever those are placed, that's where those cuts are going to be. The direction is still controlled via the slicer though. So I could remote into an object, create that null, and wherever this null is facing, that is the direction of those cuts. So we'll put that back to 90 degrees and those cuts. Selecting the matrix object now, I could say, let's randomize those positions. So I could say, hey, random. And now it doesn't care about moving left and right, but it does care about how far up and down they went. So you can see we got this variation now in between the different layers. This can get a lot more interesting though if we make a straight line. So I will create a spline pen and I just want to make a straight line. So clicking once, clicking a second time, hitting escape, that's pretty much a straight line. So let's tell our matrix cloner to clone onto an object. The object will be that spline. And let's delete the random for now. Now I've got a series of, we have a count, so we can make exactly however many we like. And then we can give it a rate. So that can be animated along the spline. We can also give a rate variation. So now those are traveling at different speeds along the spline. So we get complete control over that. But then things can get even more interesting if we go into our spline tab. So inside of slicer, going to the spline tab, we can explode the layers. And once we explode the layers, and the layer would mean that this part is still part of the same one over here as long as it's part of the same slice chopping across. Now that we've exploded those, I will lock this, deselect so it's not highlighted anymore. And under colorize, we've got a bunch of cool options. One of them is grayscale. This is going to randomly assign a different color from black to white, any value, and give you any random one. We've got a random seed here that we can click and get a different random seed on them. Instead of grayscale, we could say random, and we get a completely random layout of colors. We can change that however we like. And then we've also got as input, which right now we're not really set up easily, but let me show you. This has nothing to do with the matrix right now. But if we take this text object inside of the text, let me unlock. Under letters, under transform, this is how the color is being controlled. So I could change this to any color that way. And I believe I could add in a random effector. And let's randomize the color. Yeah, so that should randomize the color. And change a different random seed until we get something that's kind of colorful. Good enough. And now if we go back into the slicer and hide the text, I could say I want to take the slices as input and feed in. Actually, I wanted to set this to, I shouldn't have been feeding the text. Anyway, I shouldn't have not done that part. I want to feed the random into the matrix object. So let's put the matrix back to black and then feed in this random effector into that. So now you can see we're getting random colors on the matrix. They're going to be going into the negative because min-max is set to 0 or it's negative 100. So let's say 0. And now we have every possible random color of the rainbow being applied to that, to this matrix object. So if we go into the slicer and say, I would like to, let me again lock those and then deselect. Instead of being like grayscale or something, we can say from matrix, and now it's going to take on the exact color of the matrix clone So that now means we could control these colors directly via MoGraph objects. Deleting out that random, I could say, take the matrix and feed in, let's put a plane effector. Yeah, plane effector. Don't affect, oop, I locked, that's what it's stripping me up. So plane effector, don't affect position. Yes, take on the field color. In the fall off, we can feed it any color. So we could feed it index, but I'll just take a random. And the random one should affect the colors. So you see we get these random colors. But inside of the color remap, we could say, give it a gradient. So here's a gradient of colors. Now it's a black and white gradient, but let's load the preset and feed in, I don't know, let's grab this scheme, select all of those and say, distribute knots, how do we, oh, smooth. So yeah, set those to smooth. So it's going to be transitioning between all of those and we get complete control over them that way while these colors are traveling through. So we could create this crazy looping animation any direction. We could change this rotating angle, move that forward, move it back, make as many clones as we want. So we can make ton more cuts and it'll just be taking on the colors that we're feeding through MoGraph. I love being able to implement MoGraph tools and effectors into the things we're making because it just opens up so many more design possibilities of having complete control over exactly what's going to happen. Now, when it comes to colorizing splines like this, it's going to be really handy in your third-party renderers. So in this case, I'll pop open Redshift. I do have a demo of Octane and of Arnold, but I just don't know them well enough to talk, although beta testers do test those out for me. But anyway, I'm going to hit render on that, and we've got our spline, but I want that to render something, obviously. So in order to render, we need to add in a Redshift object tag and say that, hey, this curve for spline, it should be seen as hair strands, but nothing happened. Why is that? Well, inside of the slicer, inside of the spline tab, the tag is not getting copied to the children automatically. So if you drag a tag into this tag to segments, which we designed, then instantly, with any luck, you can see that, boom, they automatically show up. And because they already have that color, Redshift is seeing that color. But of course, if you were to make a Redshift material, you could apply said material and open up your Redshift shader graph and pull in something like user data. And I know every third-party renderer has something along these lines. So you could pull in the user data and say, hey, I want to take on the display color. And if we say, okay, display color, I want you to feed out to, let's get rid of color and put a overall emission of, let's say, 3. So this emission color is what I want to control. So let's output the color to emission, and now you see we essentially have a luminant channel, a super bright luminant channel, taking on the colors that we assign through the spline, and that will all filter through. That will all perfectly filter through with, sorry, I keep getting phone calls. Go away, phone. I just completely lost my train of thought. Oh yeah, oh, I was just going to change the color again. So yeah, it's filtering through the color. So if we were to go into our gradient and change any one of these colors, then that should filter up, well, filter to the matrix, which filters the slicer, and then there it is in the render. So complete control over those. Terry is asking, what is the utility, the spline utility? It's an upcoming plugin. It's going to be an upcoming plugin suite. And as a quick preview, we're not going to go over all of them, but there's going to be Bezier, cleanup, reduction, smooth. Yeah, those are the 5 tools. So yeah, Bezier, cleanup, reduction. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped over resample and smooth are the upcoming spline utilities. And those all 5 will be in a single bundle. Let's see. Yep, Bradley's watched the demo earlier, the recorded one. Yeah, somebody's asking about how I did the watercolor effect. Yeah, there's 2 different major things going on. One is definitely vertex maps. And welcome, DNA and Jed and Logan. Thanks for coming, hanging out. Let me think. Yeah, it's going to be difficult to do the watercolor one in a live stream because essentially you just need a giant plane with a lot of vertex maps. But the there's a lot of things that you would do in a render that you wouldn't want to do. There's a lot of things you would do in a render where it's like going to go in process for a long time. And then you've got the things you would do in a demonstration or a live stream where you don't want to have it take too long. You know, even when we're doing the regular Rocket Lasso Live, that I'm trying to keep everything as low poly and everything running quickly because, you know, you can let a render go overnight. But if you're live streaming, then you definitely want things moving really, really snappy. But let's see how well we can get a version of this working. We're going to keep it pretty light, though. So to begin with, we need something to cut. I'm going to keep it as simple as possible. We'll just make a landscape. And we'll give it a different seed because everybody always has that default landscape. Under extensions, we'll make a slicer. And I can feed it as a child, I think. I'll put a couple extra slices, go from the bottom, auto scale it, collapse. We don't need that many, especially if we're keeping this quick. Let's collapse them all to be flat. And I'd also like to move it up into the air. Yeah, just so we have a series of rings going. So that was the goal. Now I could take that entire thing and move it up into the air. Then create a plane and make the plane a bit bigger. Go 800 by 800. And I don't know how many points we can get away with and run relatively quickly. I think that's reasonable, but the resolution is going to be very, very small. Keep in mind, I will have done like 10 times the resolution in the actual animation. So if we've got this spline, let's see what our subdivisions look like on it. How many subdivisions are on there? Actually, it's more about what the distance is. I'm going to smooth that out by one. Let me get my thoughts aligned. I would like to start deforming the slicer and let the different parts of it drip down. How would I go about doing that? Well, first, I probably don't want the landscape to be a child. It might get deformed then. So let me just remote link into that. Boop. Simple enough. And now we need to start deforming this plane down somehow. So create a plane effector, make it a child, and let's deform it. So say point deform, and everything gets pushed upward. I'll make sure it is getting pushed upward by setting the transform space to effector, so it's getting pushed up on Y. But let's say instead it's getting pushed down. I don't know how far, so let's just view this from the side and start pushing it down until it looks like it's going to be pretty much right there on the plane. So minus 190, it's a fine number. So that's deforming every single point straight downward, which is fine. But we don't want it to apply everywhere, so let's temporarily turn that off. I want a start point. So how could we generate a start point on the line? Well, we can do that with a matrix object. So let's make a matrix. And the matrix will clone onto an object, and the object will be the slicer. And now we're getting 10 clones per line. I'm going to say I only want one. And now you're going to see them all pretty much aligning pretty well on kind of the Z plus most area. And that is because the slicer has settings for placing the first point exactly where you want to. In this case, if we go to the Modify tab, you can see there's Set First Point. And currently it's saying, set it to the Z plus most point on any given section. So that's the Z most, that's the Z most, and each of those is the Z most. But in this case, I want them randomly placed, and we actually have a setting for that. I can click Random, and now the first point of the spline, like literally the first point, travels around, and it's the last point. But you can randomize that through that random. So now each one of these has exactly one point. So the plane effector can get that fed in as a bit of a source. So let's say that it's seeing the matrix as a point object, and now you can see exactly where those had been is the only place is getting deformed downward. So yeah, that's actually doing a great job for us. Now, that's actually going to create a feedback loop. How can I do this? Do I need to make that editable? Because, yeah, right now we're getting a feedback loop, which isn't surprising because we're cloning onto an object, which is then deformed. Yeah, this is really easy. We can just make a duplicate. So I'm going to say, don't deform that one, and we'll hide it. So the matrix is cloning onto this one, and then this one's the one getting deformed. That way there's not a feedback loop, and really easy to make a copy that way. Okay, so now we have a matrix. Now I would like, in the plane effector, to create a grow, which is actually a freeze. And the freeze, I'll have to remember exactly what I want to do, but let's say add, and it's going to grow, and right now it's a radius of 10 with a strength 100. Let's see if that's enough. Hit play, and yeah, that's totally enough. So now you'll see that it's taking that first point and slowly spreading along the lines, and you see they're translating from that upper area down to this lower one. So if we put our camera down a little bit lower, look at this automatic like drawing on animation that we get. That's automatic. It's getting placed exactly wherever we put those matrices. We could even say, hey, make 2 copies per line, and now each of those will start in 2 places and draw twice as quick. Now, all that's going to be based very much on the way you set your freeze up. So if we set the effect strength down to like 10%, you're going to see that they're going to grow a lot slower. Now, you need enough resolution on your line so that that wouldn't look like it's deforming too much. Right now, you see the individual like flop, 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 flop. We might be able to fix that via the spline tab. If we go into the spline tab in Slicer, I could say, hey, I would like you to subdivide somehow. So let's say it's a B-spline subdivision set to subdivided. And I don't know if this will work, but let me lower it. Yeah, actually it does work. So dropping that down to 2, there's just a lot more subdivisions, and you see how much smoother that's starting to look. So yeah, just a little extra something there. And I think there's even, we could even do something like, I don't know if it'll, for sure it will work, but let's try putting a decay on top of it, and that's going to look at everything that comes below. And yeah, see immediately that's set to smooth, and look how much it's slowing that all down. So that could be a really nice addition to have those not hit as sharply. And you see we get a bit of a curve now, so it doesn't just flop into the ground, and that's completely controlled by the smooth now. So we could lower that, and it's going to go quicker, and you'll get less of a curve, but you can see how, yeah, no, it's just a really fun combination. And keep in mind, this is working really great with Slicer, and we could make any changes we want to it, but this technique doesn't have to be in Slicer. It could be on any spline. But I really like, yeah, I mean, everybody who's watching this stream, anybody who's a regular stream knows that my main goal is to make sure that everybody has as much knowledge as they can about this stuff. So the tools are just supposed to unlock more creativity and options and possibilities, but I'm not going to, I never want to be like the salesman and be like, hey, here's the, like, you can only do this if you have the tool. It's like, no, this has just created new possibilities, but you know, certain things are applicable all over the place. But anyway, we could make any changes we want. We could add twice as many slices. So let's double those up, and now you see there'll be a lot more. Now keep in mind that the growth isn't necessarily stuck to a single line. It can jump from line to line. So that's why you see multiple lines here kind of spreading out on each other. So because we subdivided more, we could probably get away with decreasing the radius here. So if I cut that in half, but it depends on how far apart any given line is. Yeah, some of them are still clustered up, so I don't know how far we can go. We definitely say 2, but even that seems to, oh, and keep in mind you gotta clear. I'm not sure if that's the case here, but when you change these numbers, sometimes you have to hit clear on the freeze. But in this case, yeah, a little bit of radius seems to go a long way, so let's not put too many lines. We'll drop that back down to 8. Anyway, yeah, so we got these lines growing now, and then a lot of the watercolor effect that I did is that, we'll check something. It looks a little different than it did. Yeah, that's interesting. The that part's dripping down, but there isn't a matrix object there. I think maybe the freeze is still remembering. And also this delay might not be helping. So let's reset that down and then clear and then reactivate them. There we go. That actually fixed it. I think we had to turn off the delay before we hit clear. Otherwise, it was seeing that delay as part of the thing. And the delay, of course, has a delay on it. So anyway, we put this back up to something quicker. And let those start spreading out faster. Okay, so we're going to keep it very simple on the vertex map, like I said, just to keep this running quickly. Like, that's running nice and quick. But making this plane editable, we can add on a Cinema 4D selection, set vertex weight to make a vertex map. That map will use fields. Don't use a freeze yet. And then take on this slicer spline. And now I want that to, right now it's, the spline comes in default as curved. I'm going to say as a, I'm sorry, the distance mode was along. I'm going to say radius. So now we have a set radius around it. And like I said, not a very high resolution here. But as those splines are falling down, you're going to see that those layers are taking on the color of it. So you could imagine, and now that that's happening, we could also put a growth on top of this. So let's add, what I might do is make a second vertex map. And this, you always got to give it a name, so I'll just call it 2. And in this vertex map, I shall delete out the original and just feed this one in. So now it's referencing that first one into the second. And as that gets referenced, we could say average out, and now you see it's going to blur and get a lot smoother, which can go a long way for, you know, making these things cleaner. But yeah, that's now referencing the other one, which is in general a good idea because now we could use another freeze. And this freeze can, again, grow. And we have to make sure the radius is large enough to make these jumps, which it seems quite large. Okay, that's now large enough to see it. We're going to set the effect strength way down, let's say like 5%. And now as these, that one, we have to rewind all the way and then hit clear to make sure it's empty in the beginning. And now as these lines fall, the effect strength is, set that to add probably. Yeah, there we go. So now as those lines fall, that will spread out, but also we've got this growing effect on top of it. So that's, I'm going to lower this effect strength even more. Yeah, now you can see it more slowly spreading out. So you can imagine taking that and remapping it and feeding it through your materials. So I did things like make it into a mask, and I fed it into the reflectance channel so that it got really shiny in certain spots. Oh, and just for clarity, I guess because we're talking about a specific animation, I should have pulled it up. Let me open up, actually I opened up the full animation for that. Renders, watercolors. So yeah, here's the effect that we're talking about. I should have done that as a bit of context. So yeah, you can clearly see the setup that I'm doing here. I put a bunch of like papery textures on top of it to help hide some of the resolution. And yeah, just letting it spread. You can see how it gets super shiny as the liquid parts approach. So that I think that really helps sell that. So yeah, it was a fun one to put together, just as a weird kind of vertex map experiment. It'd be great if there's a way of like, it just sucks once you make a vertex map that we got, you know, this is probably like 50,000 points, maybe 100,000 points to get the resolution to make this look good. It'd be nice if there was a way of getting around that, but anyway, it worked well. So yeah, I love this melty dripping technique though, and that's kind of completely outside of the idea of this watercolor technique. The and yeah, I'd love to explore that more in the future. But yeah, thank you, great question. The let's take a look at. Let me look at my list of ideas for the stream. Okay. Well, here's kind of the biggest one, and I did a lot of stuff with this technique. Before I forget, let me pull up the contextual video for this one. Wait, there's some follow-up questions here. TJ, what's going on? Can you do a watercolor effect that goes in one direction so it can be a fountain pen writing on? Yeah, I don't see any reason why you wouldn't be able to. I'm trying to think if we could make this editable or not editable. Let me get rid of... We're only talking about the growth here, so let me disable those. So if we tell both of these splines to be open splines, then they don't close. You'll see there's a hole in them. And then if we make the distance small enough, it's going to be really hard to get the proper distance here. As a way of simplifying and making sure they don't hop, I'm going to put a single slice. So yeah, now we've got a single slice. As earlier, we do need to turn off the delay and tell the freeze to clear. Maybe also the matrix. Yeah, just to get that to reset. Okay, now that is an open spline. You can see right there the gap. So if I were to take that matrix and say, hey, scoot over a little bit. So you see how there's that gap there? But you see how large of a radius this is? So we need that to be really small. So in the original plane, it's seeing this matrix, but it's a giant radius. I'm going to set that down to 1. And yeah, now that's set down to 1. Maybe we could scoot it back more. Boop, boop, boop. Okay, so now you see there's just one little bit of line. But, well, if I hit play, let's see what happens. Yeah, you see it jumped the gap onto that one? And that's because the current freeze is larger than that gap currently was. I'm trying to not to make it editable. Let me see if we can lower the radius down. Okay, there we go. Now by just shrinking that radius is now too small to jump that gap. So it depends on how, we have to be very precise with our placement of this matrix object. But even doing that might be okay. Let's see what happens. Yeah, cool. With that placement, now you see only one side of the line was able to catch it, and now we just got one. There's just one line. So that essentially, yes, you can totally do the technique with it. You just need an open spline instead of a closed spline. It looks like one of the points were slightly too far apart, so it didn't quite jump that gap, but that's as easy as changing the spline to probably be 1.5. And now that the radius is so small, I would probably want the effect strength to be a little bit stronger. And yeah, now we got a single side traveling along. It's all dependent on the resolution of the line and the distance you put by feeding in the radius in the various places. But yeah, totally get that growth technique going, and just by moving the camera down, you can frame that out. I mean, you could have that, you could have this upper one be like 1,000,000 miles away if you wanted it to really be hidden. I'm trying to think if there'd be a way of cropping it out. There might be. But yeah. Yep, it seems like that tackled that question. So, okay, I want to talk about a advanced landscape technique. And so essentially, in cinema, we've been using this landscape object. But what if we made our own landscapes and started making really cool things from that? And in order to make that, I had made this animation. So I'm going to turn on audio so it plays. And I made this. That's the same watercolor one. I made this. It was really, really fun to put those together, and you can see how many, like, that was like over the course of like 2 days, I was just exploring like different looks and different things that look cool. So how would you go about making something, maybe something a little bit like that? So keep in mind, we're trying to make a landscape concept. So let's make a plane and keep it simple. I'm gonna say 1,000 for width, 500 for height. And then we can say 100 for width and 50 for height. So if I hit NB, you can see we've got a perfect grid shape here. So let's type something in. Create some text, lay it flat on the ground. Set it to, let's get a nice skinny font. Is there an obvious one here? Oh, that one's not as thin as it looked. That one's not as thin as it looks. What's a really, really thin font? Ink free? Yeah, that's a weird one. We'll keep that. I'm just going to type in party because we're in a launch party. So now that we've got that, I shall center it. Middle. T for scale, make it as large as we want to. Center it a bit more. And I like making a connect object and dropping in. You don't need to, but that just keeps it. It's kind of like that's a text object now. I'll even call it text. And it just means it's pivoting from the 0 point, which I wish that the text object could automatically pivot from the 0 point. Anyway, let us deform this plane. We actually did a little deformation already, so it should be straightforward. Make a plane, drop it as a plane effector, make it a child of the plane geometry. I like renaming these deformers .deform because, for most people, this plane effector is an effector, but you can change it into a deformer by saying deformer point. So now I would like to deform on the space of the effector, which means it's pushing it straight up, which is what I want. I'd like it to push up, let's say 200. That might be a lot. It's kind of small, so we'll do 100 for now. So it's pushing up 100, but we want to limit where it's pushing up. So let's turn on a fall off, and inside that fall off, we'll drag the text, which will be seen as a spline object. Now, the instant we do that, we're going to get this crazy looking thing, which is kind of neat. I don't even know how to explain it. It's traveling along the spline, and whichever edge is closest to whatever spline, it's taking on the height of that spline depending on the percentage of the way along it. And it's per segment. So you can actually still kind of read the word party there. But for our purposes, let's use a mask instead. So selecting the text, I don't want this to be a curve, but instead be a mask. The mask by default is on Z+, so it's traveling along there. But if we say travel along Y, there we go. Now we get the word party, and it's popping up into this overall object. So you can already see how this is like a little bit of a landscape concept. But let's push it further by grabbing the distance and increasing that. And what I'd like to do is increase this distance until every edge is slightly up in the air. So you can see that the word party is there. Maybe not super readable, but it's definitely there. Why don't we remap that immediately? So inside of remapping, I will change this straight line to a contour curve. Now that curve can look nice and sharp if we take this top one and drag it down. So now you see this top bit gets lots of definition and it fades out. So lots of control that way. But if we're going to do a landscape concept, we want this to perfectly crop off at the edges. We don't want this popped up off the ground at the edge. So in order to get that to fade out properly, actually I'm going to shrink that party down just a little bit. To get that to fade out, why don't we add another effector? In this case, it'll be a box field. So there's a box field, hitting T for scale. We can just scale this up until, actually let's go to a top view. I want to scale this up until it's not quite hitting the edge on any side. So that means that outermost one is going to have no effect. And now, if we set our box field to multiply, then now it's going to take those edges and push them down, and you see we kind of get that overall landscape look. Now let's get the fall off a little bit larger because I don't want the text to get cropped out. And then I'd like that to be a bit smoother. So again, into the remapping, we can go to curve, and I'd like it to very rapidly ramp up from the edge, and then the top, let's keep that nice and smooth. So that just blends everything together really nicely. Okay, so let's introduce a slicer into the equation. Rename the plane to landscape. In fact, let's say custom landscape. And then create a extension slicer. Move that to the bottom. And reference our original model. Let's hide it for now. Easy to turn on and off. And let's pivot from the bottom. And yeah, now we can make as many slices as we like, make a bunch of cuts. And now you can see how we're getting a bunch of layers. And it's actually decently readable. A couple things to cover while it's really simple right now. I think we might be able to see some examples of it. Let's unhide the object and zoom in a bit. And okay, yeah, we can see it here. Do you see how, like, we can see this line really, our lines really clearly in a bunch of spots, but we can't see it right here. Why can't we see the line here? Well, that's because all of these are made up of quads. These are all four-sided polygons, but every four-sided polygon is essentially two triangles. And a quad can be twisted in such a way that it's not flat. And you'll see here, if I spin my camera around, that this polygon is not flat. There's definitely a bend inside of a single polygon. Now, we compensated for that too. Inside of the slicer, you always want as few points as possible, but you do have the option to say, under modify, to see the non-planar points. So as soon as I turn that on, then internally we are triangulating. We're doing the math to triangulate it. Well, we're not triangulating, but we're doing the math to correctly interconnect the points and see if we're colliding with it. And that now makes it so we're perfectly seeing the edge everywhere. No easy way to say, I'm trying to think of a good way to explain it. The remove redundant points. We'll talk about that in a little bit, but for now I will turn that off. So yeah, now we got all these edges going around. So again, let's hide the geometry. And now you can see the text is pretty readable overall. We can see the word party sneaking out on the top, but that will become better if we go to geometry, and let's turn on a flat, put the shadow in between them. A little SSAO, just get them to pop out from each other. And yeah, so now we can get this landscape effect creating text. We see these edges, but they look a little bit rough. So into the main tab, we can add on a little bit of smoothing. And look at that. Oh, look how nice that smoothing is. It's so important. Yeah, so we put the smoothing in there and get those popping out that way. We can go into geometry and make this actually extruded percentage. Get those eating up all the space, super even, cleaning up all the way through. Actually, yeah, now I can show you. I'm gonna get rid of the smoothing. So we're cutting all these edges, but we have this special setting that's turned on by default called remove redundant points, and that gets rid of any very straight edges. So if I leave that on, you're gonna see that Slicer is detecting that this is a perfectly straight edge and thus gets rid of this middle point because that middle point's not adding anything to it. But if we're going to be doing a bunch of smoothing, then there are situations where you just want to keep all of them. So anyway, let's put that back to being very smooth. You see how even that all gets? We get this nice clean text popping out on the top. Make as many layers as you want. Because it's percentage based, we could drop the number of layers and they still perfectly interconnect with each other. And now we get, yeah, that's actually working better. Get the word party up there. We are doing a lot of smoothing, so there's always a chance that there'll be a pop, but let's put a little bit of rate and hit play. And now these are traveling up. Let's go faster. 25. So yeah, we get this perfect looping animation where it's gonna, well, every slice goes from the bottom up to the top before it disappears. So very fun. You can also type in a negative number. Any place that we could make an unlocked variable, you can always go above and beyond. For instance, like we could take the spacing and then put double the spacing in between them. And you could even go negative and put negative spacing on there. So they're actually coming from the bottom. So yeah, you can, pretty much every variable, anyone that is possible to be unclamped is unclamped. So yeah, there we get this animation going, which is fun. But well, let's tinker around a little bit more still. So there's a lot of variables going. You could, like the resolution here is determined by the original landscape object. So if we go to the original landscape, if we make the number half as many, then we'll have, actually if you cut it by half and by half, you'll have 1/4 of the points, which will run way quicker. But it would also be way smoother. Every iteration of smoothing would be smoothing all the more. But what I want to do is let's add in some extra randomness onto here. So that's pretty straightforward and it's cool. You can do a lot with Slicer directly out of that. But inside of the deforming, the plane deformer, let's add in a random noise. So here's a random field. I will set that to overlay, move it below the box field, and under field, let's make that way larger. So any scale we want. And I can see how the landscape's kind of getting some extra variation. The word party is still popping through. You can definitely still see that is there. But now we've got an extra noise. We can do any kind of noise type we like, but let's keep it simple for now. And turn back on our slicer. Hide that. And now you can see we get this variation all over the place based on where that noise is. If I hit play, that will be traveling through still. Let's stop the rate from going. You see it's static, but if we go into that random field, let's give that some animation speed. So now the underlying geometry is animating. And this, so all this, the slicer is completely updating based on the noise that is underneath it. We can make any changes we like here. Obviously, this could be a spline. This could be flat geometry. Smooth it out more or less. You see how quick it goes with just a spline. Make as many slices as we could possibly want. The speed, obviously, goes slower when you have more geometry. That's just from the extrude. Turn off. Save frames. So yeah, we get these. Oh yeah, we get all of these traveling through. Like, I just love this stuff. So we've got one mode we haven't looked at all, and that is landscape mode. So I'm gonna go easy on some of the smoothing, although I think it'll still work. And let's turn on landscape. The reason it used to be called alternating, but alternating wasn't super clear on when it was available to be used. So do you remember when we were talking earlier about the way the extrude will automatically interlink every other layer? Well, we hard-coded our own version of that in. So if I click on landscape, it is now going to alternate every other layer. Essentially, every other layer is moving down to the layer before it, and then they can get properly interlinked. So now we've got this alternating layer. Let's just hit play. It should still be animating. Turn off our widget just so that that's not in our way. We can even hide that original bit of text. And now we've got that noise animating on top of this. Let's get some rate going. So let's add on, not too fast, let's do 15. These will now be traveling up and then erasing out, and when that layer disappears, it'll pop back in on the bottom. Then we could take all of those layers and flatten them down to the bottom. So now it's a flattened object, and we still get this returning. And now you can clearly see some of the inspiration for that commercial here, or this animation I did, where by taking these layers and flattening them down, you can translate essentially a height map. Our landscape is kind of a height map, and we're translating that into a series of lines. And you can start making all these super crazy patterns. For instance, we could change that noise type just by changing this noise type. Let's change it to like a Voronoi 3. And look at these crazy like circular patterns we get. And those are still animated. And oh man, there's so many combinations. There's so many additional possibilities here. The let's take a look at Bevel. Bevel, I'm not going to hit play because I mean it'll still go, but it's going to go slower. Under landscape, we still have all the other same options. So I could say, okay, let's add on. We don't need the start cap or the start bevel, but let's go and add on. And let's actually make this absolute. So I'm going to say this is 25 units tall. And then let's give it a bevel of, I don't know, 15. Now, as long as you're in newer versions of Cinema, I guess it's in every version of Cinema except for R20. And we do go back to R20. But in R20, they didn't have the new bevels yet, and the new bevels are wonderful. So you'll see here, look at this amazing geometry you get because of how nice the bevels work in Cinema now. And that's by me intentionally overshooting it. And I don't know, there's just something about this look that's so cool. We put the spacing back in again, so those could again get like this height. We could, because we're on an absolute scale now, you get these crazy kind of landscapes going, but I could also just make this way taller. Let's say it's 100 tall. So now these are all extruding, so they kind of like intersect with each other, or they're, you know, interlinking properly. So now the word party can pop out way on the top. Very, very nice. Oh, actually, the bottom looks pretty cool too, because I turned off the start caps. But yeah, look how crazy that looks down there. But yeah, the bevels aren't going to. I mean, we can go hit play, but it's not going to be running super smooth with all of these bevels going on. So let me check the chat. Are you able to color the word party separately? No, Trey, that's actually a very good question. Now, we are trying to make everything go as fast as we possibly could. Like I said, we're doing so much work to work around the limitations of the extrude to make this all return properly. So, and like I said, it's not even the extrude's fault. It's that, you know, the extrude has been around for a long time and it was ever fed simple splines. Now we're feeding it crazy splines, and they just weren't designed. It wasn't designed to handle this. So we could, what's the best way of explaining this? If we go to no geometry, if we say none, then we can go to spline and we can return this as a series of exploded layers. But you can't do that once you turn on geometry. Once you turn on like landscape, this is all grayed out because those are just for splines. So we're not exploding individual layers. So we cannot individually colorize these layers this way. But, let's set that to an extrude and turn off the bevel and chill out on the overall height of these. What if we change the entire concept around a little bit? And this is kind of smoothly transitioning into the next thing I want to talk about anyway, and that is the idea, oh, that looks cool. That is the idea of using slicer in a cloner. So here's the concept. Let's simplify this as much as we can. I'm going to make a single cut, a cut of 1. Give it a rate of 0. Give it a spacing of 0. So now we're getting one cut. This cut will be wherever I place it. If I move it up in the air, it's going to disappear. If I move it down, it's going to get as big as the landscape allows me to. So you can see what's happening there. So what if we take this slicer and we put it into a cloner? So I'm going to put that into a cloner. And let's say it's making one, actually, let's make this linear. So I'm going to say, how thick are those cuts? I think they're 10. So let's put 10 on Y, and then we'll make a different clone. And now I'm cloning, instead of slicer making each cut, this cloner is now making 10 different slicers. So you can see how each of those is cutting up through the model. Each of them is returning. There is a little bit more calculation time because the slicer has to reorganize all of the points that it's being fed. But now I've got all these individual clones going, and that's actually pretty straightforward because we could now take that cloner and do whatever we like with it. So let's add on I'll do a plane effector. Don't actually affect the position, but I would like to affect the color, with fields color, and feed in a step effector. Let's change that to a gradient and then say affect color. And now, looks like that loops around somehow. So I'm going to ignore that first one, but we should be able to load in, let's put in this rainbow one. And now you can see how we can colorize these. I'm not sure what we need to do I'm not sure why that first one's getting colored white. Something to do with the cloner. Not sure what setting does that. Color, maybe the alpha being on, not being on. Yeah, I'm not sure about the first one. But anyway, the point being, you can see how we can feed the colors through here because every single clone, every single slicer is a completely unique object. I mean, along those lines, we could add additional settings on each of those. Not something I've specifically done, but we could make a, oh, that's interesting. It suddenly did color once I put a second one in. We could modify these and blend between them. So let's say, hey, cloner, blend between those two different types of slicers. And there's not too many things to change, but let's go and give one of them some bevel. Nope, did it backwards. Well, even that's fine. You'll see here on the bottom, it's a bevel of 5, and it's less, until finally we get to the top, and there's no bevel. So we're now blending between two of them. I absolutely love the blend mode in cloners because it just, it's like it unlocks like every other thing you might possibly want to do. So yeah, we can crank that up to anything we want and get those smoothly blending up with every single color. And yeah, unlimited possibilities of ways to combine that. It really is crazy. So yeah, thanks for the question, Trey. Justin, that's a good question. I'll see if I can get there in a moment. While we're still here on the cloner question, I would like to do a different model. What's the best way I want to tackle this? Let's open up a new file and actually I'll do it similar to the way I did it in the demo. So if you search for the word man, there's a bunch of human models here inside of the assets browser. So I'm just going to steal the waving man. And sorry about you, but I just need your head. So we'll delete the rest. His neck is kind of freaky looking, so I'm just going to shrink that down and put him on a pedestal just so we don't have to look at his neck stump. Okay, so there's the poor guy. We'll have him look up in the air. He's fine. He's now a statue. Okay, so let's feed that into a volume builder. Yeah, volume builder. Put both of those inside, and then put that into a volume mesher, and give it way more resolution. Yeah, that's looking pretty good. So that is just a chunk of geometry. We do whatever we want with it. So we'll make a slicer. Now you saw, well, the slicer doesn't have any parameters for adding different angles in, because every time if you were to not slice along a particular axis, then you'd have to resort the points every single time, and that's just a lot more calculation time. But if you do want to do it, you can do it with a cloner. So let's do a very similar thing. I'm going to do exactly one cut with no spread. So it's all zeroed out onto a single line. Also, this character is way up in the air. So I'll just move it down. So that's a single cut. Let's, again, do a similar setup. Put that into a cloner. Clone linear. Put, I don't know, 5 units between each one, and we'll do some cuts. Tell this to be linked to a model. That's the model. You see cut, 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 cut. Put, probably even less space here. Let's do 2. And then we can do more. Okay, each one of those is a completely different slicer cut. But because each one is its own model, we are able to do things like put a random effector on there. Now, before we were doing a random effector on a matrix that was determining where the cut would be, and that would be on a single slicer, which would calculate quicker. But now I could say, hey, don't affect position. Now I'd like to affect rotation. So now every single one of those slicers can be rotated to their own angle. So let's hide the original model. And now you can see we've got a series of cuts at completely arbitrary angles. So back into the slicer, tell that to return some flat geometry. And you see we get some crazy weird abstract flat cuts. Let's make, how do I want to do it? Let's put less spacing again. Put more cuts, so we're making a lot of different cuts now. And then add more randomness. Let's add in up to 90. So now you see that it's made cut after cut on all these completely arbitrary angles, and you're able to fill out the form that way. So, a lot of possibilities on top of it like this. That's returning geometry. We could be returning a spline. So let's return spline. Actually, let's do extruded while we're here. So we can actually give those thickness if we wanted to. But we can say, let's return it as a spline. I'm pretty sure we should feed this into a connect object. And now it's in the connect. That could be fed into a nice sweep, and that sweep can be fed a end side. T for scale. It's a super huge end side. Shrink them down, and yeah, just get this nice wiry look just kind of around the perimeter. Something similar to Ricochet, but this is literally cutting the geometry. Not doing the exact same thing, obviously, but yeah, you can get this cool kind of wire mesh going on top of that. And then something that I do think is neat is, let's do a similar concept, but instead of doing a random slice, and well, instead of randomizing the slices, what if we did a series of flat cuts? So let's change this cloner to a count of 1 and drop in slicer. Siri just heard me say something. We need no random. So selecting the cloner, I would like to set this to radial. And let's see, what's the best way of showing? I'm going to pull off slicer for a second, and then instead just put in a plane. So let's put that into the cloner. So that plane should be set to Z+. Okay, so now you can see what's happening. We're getting the star pattern. So in the cloner, I'm going to say, hey, no radius. And now we can start adding additional clones. And you'll see every other one kind of aligns with the opposite one. So you want to keep this as an odd number to get as many out of it as you can. So as long as we keep this an odd number, let's do the same concept with slicer. I'm going to say, okay, slice based on Z+. Drop that in instead of the plane. And now we have a series of radial cuts happening across the model of the character, hiding that character. Let's turn on flat. And now look at this crazy radial look. Like, it's so cool. It's so, there's so many combinations here. I haven't gotten to explore the design space of this. Like, I've barely gotten to do anything so far with the possibilities. So a lot of fun to be had here just by adding in things like that. I mean, the entire landscape, or not landscape, the still life I did. Let me open up the still life animation. So yeah, this, every piece of geometry that you see on the screen is slicer. There's a slicer doing something. I took a lot of models from the content browser and from the just models from everywhere, and chopped, you know, here's just text, here's models, there's volume builders, but just chopping up everything to make all these different combinations. So you can see the radial pattern happening up here on this skull. So we get the radial going, and then similar things happening on this plant, a bunch of radial ones, radial here. I think some of the fruit does, no, maybe not, but yeah, so many combinations. It's really fun. So I'd like to do a little bit of stuff with text, but before we do, somebody who asked it, Justin was asking about the cardboard animation, and I don't know how well that will demo in real time. And I'm trying to think of a different way I could tackle it. So you see this cardboard person. And the reason I say that is the technique I did, Slicer is doing a great job on it, but the technique I did uses a Boole, and everybody knows that Booles are not exactly the fastest thing in the world. So let's talk about, let me think, if this was a regular live stream, I'd try and spend more time and think about how I might tackle that. Let's just start here on the same model, set that to bottom, feed it to model, auto scale, very handy auto scale. Put as many slices as we like, go into geometry, set it to extruded, set it to percentage, probably set that to like 99, just get a little bit of a gap in between them, and hide the original model. So yeah, now we've got a series of cuts. If we were inclined, we could even tilt this a little bit. Let's worry about that in a moment. Probably a good idea to put at least a single layer of smoothing on there. Let me get rid of the remove redundant points. Single layer of smoothing just so that these get a lot more even. And if we look at this from the side and we zoom way up, you should see a small gap in between each of them. I think if you're going to use a Boole, that's a good idea. I'm going to overshoot that a little bit. Yeah, I just want that top of the head to be rounded out more. Okay, so what did I actually do to make the cardboard? Well, I made a special rig. What's the spacing between here? Oh, I didn't talk about this at all, but right now we're using total size for the spacing, but there's a pretty cool setting. If we click convert, it'll actually put it to per step, and I can see that there is 2.07. I'm gonna make it a very even 2 between each one, just so it, like, we just know there's exactly 2. And I can even click convert to go back to the total size, and you see it doesn't visually change at all. We did the math, so it perfectly converts those. So now we know exactly 2 in between every single one of those. Now, what I did then was I made a helix and I zeroed it out and I got rid of all these points. And now we can type in any amount of subdivision that we want. Where's the spline? Where is it? What did I do? I must have changed the height. Yeah, sorry. I got rid of the height. I didn't want to change the height. Okay, so now you see I've got this spline going across. I think what I did is I did a plane deformer. You see how much I like that. Plane deform on the effector. It'll be based on the point, and you see the entire thing flies up in the air. I'm going to say deform by 1.9 because I want slightly smaller than the thickness there. So that's going to be pushing it 1.9 units into the air. And then I put in a, how do we do this? If I put in a step, a step effector, is there a modulo range map? No. Yeah, there's no modulo. Remap? Nope. Could have sworn I used a step. Could probably use a formula. Let me think. It'd be really good if I could get this working. Yeah, possibly formula. The all I want to do is get this to become a zigzag. I'm trying to do it in a parametric way. So I'm overthinking what it is, but we can do it. We can do it with a formula. Maybe formula would be the way to do it. So yeah, in formula, it is currently seeing all this information from below. It gives us these variables. All we want is the ID, I believe. So if we type in mod bracket ID 2 bracket, oh, I forgot the semicolon. There we go. That's all. Yeah, maybe that's all that I had done. So you can see that we're taking now, this is a modulo. So we're taking it and we're saying, hey, take the ID, and then every time it hits 2, reset the 0. So it's going 0, 1. Oh, I hit a 2, so go back to 0, 1. So it's going 0, 1, 0, 1, 0, 1. And that is now translating to offsetting every single one of those. Sorry about overthinking that, but yeah, this mod is great. So now that that is happening, we could take that and extrude it. So feed that into an extrude. Oops. The extrude, yeah, is in the correct direction, but I don't like that mode. So I'm gonna say X, and now we can give it exactly whatever length we want. So you see we get a giant kind of like 200 by 200 grid of this. And if I were to take the plane, I could move it 100 units that way. So it becomes, yeah, 100 units that way and then 100 units that way. And now it should be centered at 0, maybe. Oh, that's not zeroed out. Now it looks centered. So now you can see that the extrude is actually at 0. So then I would take that and put it into a cloner and then clone that in a linear way. We know there's exactly 2 units between every single one of those, so we can go up, up, up. So we can make copy, 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 copy. And if we did this correctly, which we didn't necessarily, actually, as long as we do one layer, then all of them should be fine. So if we view this from the correct angle, so here's one, you'll see that this is a little bit more up into the air than our original model. Potentially, yeah, let's zero that out. Yeah, that moves everything up a bit. So if I just take the original null in the slicer, I can just scoot that down a hair, and now you can see that that is actually in between each layer. So This is a real brute force way of doing this, and that's super huge. What's the best way to do this? I'm going to take the extrude, because it's in the center, and scale it down. And then tell the extrude to go back to, I'm sorry, not the extrude, but the plane, to go back to deforming 1.9. Okay, so we got sharper zigzags going. Maybe a little sharper than cardboard would require. Actually, it's easy enough. We can just change the point count. Drop that down. It'll make it run even quicker. There we go. So then I can take the cloner and spin them randomly. So take the random and don't affect the position, but yes, affect the rotation and spin them. So you see every single one gets a different random angle. And now we've got two different pieces of geometry. Now, I don't trust the Booles pretty much. So let me save this in the files. And cardboard. Okay, so now we've got this bit of geometry and then that. I'm going to feed the cloner into a connect object. Man, I keep holding the wrong shortcut. Put that into a connect, which is welding it. It doesn't need to weld. And then those both need to go into a boole. So I'm going to say I would like a boole, and that is going to take A intersects B is the idea. So I'm going to say A intersects B. And there we go. Now that I've done that, now you see that we only get the cardboard where it's intersecting those individual layers, and they are perfectly flat. Now making a duplicate of the slicer, and I probably should have done a little bit less spacing, but I could take the slicer and say, okay, you now get a thickness of whatever, 2%? 5%? So yeah, now you see I get that thin layer in between. I could even make a second duplicate of that and offset the entire thing easily by grabbing this null. Let's go to a side view. And you take this null and scoot it down if we want, and then grab the other one and scoot that null up. So we get those little layers of separation in between. And yeah, so we get an upper layer and a lower layer of the cardboard to chop in between. We need another layer up on the top. That's easy on the slicer. If we set the slicers to per step, I can now add another slice, and you see it should keep cutting upward. I guess we run out of geometry up there. I guess that makes sense. Yeah, there's not a bit of geometry up there, so maybe I will instead undo and select all of them and convert them and say put a couple less. There we go. We didn't need the top one is what we needed there. Actually, oh, no, this is even better. Okay, because of the way the cardboard layers work, I didn't even get to explain this in the original training series, but because you see how this layer is cutting down there, but then the upper part is still based on the lower one. If we make a duplicate of this, there's a setting inside called offset, and now I can offset that by 2, and that's going to take the final cut and move that up 2 units. I forgot, that's almost exactly why I put that setting in there, was to do that. We almost went right by it. So we could scoot that up. In fact, let's scoot it up a little extra. Let's do 2.1. 2.1. I guess we want, oh yeah, we want 2 layers. So that's 1 layer. So then we'd make a duplicate of both of those and move both of those up into the air. That's what we do. So look how many slices we're using here, but it's pretty straightforward to do. So yeah, just another layer so we get the upper one and the lower one. And that is technically cutting a slightly different spot. I guess maybe that might want to go down. And yeah, that's now creating a whole series of different cuts here. And then to make the overall animation, I would, did I set this up in such a way that that would be easy to do? Maybe. If we take all these slice nulls and I were to rotate them, it's going to get a little wonky here. I don't trust the Boole. I'm going to turn the Boole off. I'll turn the cloner off as well. But we could always take all of these slicer nulls and then tilt them. You can see that the cuts are going to be random. So imagine taking all of these and combining them. I would use a constraint tag and link all of them together so they could all rotate as one. In fact, you wouldn't even have to do that. You could, yeah, that's the way I would do it. So you could grab all those and then have only one rotate. So you can imagine that I'm saying, okay, rotate randomly there, randomly, and then randomly moving them. And as long as the cloner is doing the same thing, pretty much you would just take the base of the cloner and rotate that around. And yeah, combining those, you can get this cardboard. And then, you know, and then even on top of that, you could randomize your rotation here. Just do different seeds, and I'm getting a completely different rotation on each of those. These super thin bits of the cardboard wall, that can be fed into, that's the result of this boole. So that entire final boole can be fed into a cloth surface. Don't subdivide, but yes, add thickness, not that much, 0.1, 0.2, 0.1. So yeah, that adds a little bit of thickness to the cardboard. And turn on a little bit of shadow. And yeah, that starts making your stack of cardboard. And yeah, pretty fun to build that kind of rig. And you know, even here you see we're using 5 different slicers to be able to make this type of setup, and it'd be pretty difficult to make otherwise. E39, thank you very much for picking it up. So, does anybody have any additional questions? Ma, welcome. I'm not familiar with what is included in their stuff, so I can't really speak to that. I can tell you that we've been working on this thing. We started working on this thing like 2.5 years ago. Yeah, there's so much fun and weird experiments to do. Oh yeah, I was going to say that was all the demos I immediately had, but there is one last demo I have prepped. Does anybody have any extra questions? Definitely get the questions going if you have any. Okay, so creating a text object. Let me go to Lemon Milk, which is the official font of Rocket Lasso plugins. And just set that up nice and clean. I like throwing that to Connect. Actually, Lemon Milk does have this weird thing where like one of the layers has like a double point in one spot. I think there might have been like a small mistake in the original like illustration file. But anyway, yeah, so we got this nice text object all ready to go. Now, you could slice this text up, and we can do some fun things. We already did a very basic one before, but let me show you a couple other ones. So make a slicer. Here's an important detail. If you're going to remote in, so you see I haven't been dropping things as a child too often. I often just set it to object mode. If you do set it to object mode, make sure that your slicer comes after the object you linked to. And you can link to more than one object. But move it after it because the order of operations matters then. Just like in Cinema, the tracer object, when you link objects inside of the tracer, you can get a frame of lag in the viewport if you don't make it a physically after the referenced object. So just keep that in mind. It'll still render properly, but might as well save yourself a little bit of time there. So yeah, we can go and chop this up, maybe make it a little bit taller, give that a bit of a rate. Boop. So that can be animating across. Very nice. We could round that out or subdivide it. Actually, why don't we put this into a volume builder, volume mesher. A couple extra polygons, why not? Good enough. And let's slice that up instead. So there we go, a little bit rounded. And now that that is getting created, we could always extrude that, feed that into actually I'll put it into a slicer and give that a rectangle. And I don't know, I just really like the way that looks right there. There's something about like this setup, something about this is appealing to me. Depending on the voxel size, we can round that out a bit, put some smoothing in. That's going to dramatically change the way that those look. But yeah, I love those. But anyway, so that's, you know, that's one little random thing. Once again, let's see if the optical illusion is happening. Not as much for it feeling like it's moving towards us. But you can get even more interesting looking things going. Let's turn off the rate and pull the text out of the volume. Okay, we're back to super basics. Now, what if we slice a slicer? So here's the idea. Let's feed in the text and zero out the slicer. So now we got a bunch of cuts going here. Let us hide the original object and then make as many cuts as we like. And now go into geometry and return flat. So now we got all these flat cuts. So let me set this to have some shadow. So we got all these tiny little cuts going. Those are now flat, like two-dimensional planes. So what if we take that as geometry and chop it again? Let's go and make another slicer. And this time, the reference will be this other slicer. Let's not hide it quite yet. I would like to cut along X. So let's say orientation X. We can make that as tall as we want or auto scale it, but I think I'll just drag it larger. Make as many cuts as I want. And let's go reasonable for a live stream. So those are now two-dimensional. Well, this is now cutting a series of two-dimensional planes, but I want you to notice something. On this new slicer, a warning has popped up at the bottom. It's saying open edges detected, swap to open spline. And you could say yes or no on that. But what's happening right now is these look like just straight up cuts, like chop, 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 but they're slicer by default is a closed spline. In Cinema, you can only have an open spline or a closed spline. You can't have a hybrid. So currently these are all still closed. So just to show you, if I were to feed this into a sweep and into the sweep, feed another one of our end sides, scale that way down. By default, a sweep has caps, but why don't we see any caps here? Well, we don't see any caps here because the spline is starting in one spot, traveling to the back, and then traveling back to the front. Essentially, it's like a stretched out donut right now, and there's a donut hole inside. And so a donut hole doesn't have a cap. So all we need to do is click that open spline button, and that is the exact same as, oh, let me click that. And what just happened is inside of the spline tab, it set that from closed to open. Anyway, now you can see, let me hide the original geometry. Boop. Now you can see we've got a series of hexagons making up this because we cut an object and then cut that object. So we get all these cool hexagons going. We can round those out to be perfect tubes and make as many of those as we want. We got two different settings. Here is how many there are in the height. And then we have a different setting for how many there are in the width. But then let's start making that even more interesting. Let's type in the word. Let's change the original word. And this is kind of what I did in one of the demos. But let's type in RKT. And yeah, now we got an RKT. And then why don't we, instead of feeding it this nice simple end side, feed it something more complex? Let's make another letter. And let's start out real simple. What's the letter we could tell? Let's type in the letter K. Okay. Oh, no, I don't want that. I want a spline. Let's make a spline and maybe something, yeah, Z. A Z is a good letter to do. And I'll go back to another lemon milk medium. So make it real small. So instead of that circle, why don't we drop in that letter Z? They're going to see that, okay, why is the letter Z lying on its side? Well, that's something the sweep does to choose its direction. So let's select the sweep and say, don't do any banking. So now you see we've got the letter Z, but the letter Z is going backwards. Well, that's just the direction that it happened to cut. So inside of our slicer, inside of the spline tab, there's a setting called reverse. So I'll reverse that spline. So now we've actually got the letter Z happening again and again and again. So if I hit NB, you can see that's looking pretty good. We got complete control over this. We've got the letter Z. We could repeat that as many times as we want. We could add a couple extra slices here to make sure they're perfectly butting up against each other, make more cuts here and make sure that those are filling up all the space, and look how quick that's generating. So yeah, now we've got RKT made up of the letter Z, but let's make this something curvy. I intentionally chose something geometric because if we change this to, well, let's do it now. I'm going to type in the letter P. And then you're going to see it's going to take a little bit more. Well, it's still really quick, but you see there's a lot of geometry there, but it's so small. We don't need anywhere near that many polygons. So instead, I'm going to tell that to only create one every like 35 degrees. So you can see it's a lower poly now. So now let's type in something more complex. Let's make there be a way less slices. So maybe it's going to approximately look correct. I'm going to shrink it. I'm going to eyeball this so we can get the better end result. Make a couple extra vertical cuts. There we go. And now, so we're just typing in a single word. Oh, and I should do that first. I'm going to increase this. Keep in mind that you have the option of doing crazy things like wingdings and whatnot. So if we scroll down to, I'm not sure if any of those are specifically wingdings, but you can go to any of these ones that are these crazy symbols, and it's like, oh, now you got like this letter, this flag. Let's just try typing in the letter A. What do we get? I have no idea what we'll get. Oh, we get a peace sign. So you can see how we're making this out of a whole bunch of those. So yeah, just keep that in mind. I'm going to go back to the letters, and now it doesn't have to be a single letter. Let's type in the word slicer. And now we can get the word slicer over and over and over again, making up, a text, text made up of more text. Scale that to any size, and maybe increase these cuts by a couple until they're all kind of butting up against each other. And, depending on the font, depending on the resolution, depending on what you type in, you can feed anything you want in. And even, just as an animation, it'd be really cool to, you get something like this and you start animating, you zoom out and you see text and you see more text. Like, I imagine doing this again, like baking that down as a font or baking that down as a spline and feeding that through on another one and just making layer after layer of endless combinations. Like, it can get so nuts so quickly. And keep in mind, it's all still live, so let's go and type in 1, 2, 3. So 1, 2, 3. We go A, B, C. And yeah, anything we feed in will filter through. Party. And yeah, just playing around with these combinations. Like, there's just so much fun, crazy, weird stuff to do. I guess here's a tiny one, but it's just, even though it's simple, it's such a unique look. I don't know, maybe I'm probably the only person who's going to be fascinated by this, but let's do one last thing. Open up a new file, and it's still playing with this font stuff. Let's make another text, and it doesn't have to be that font. Let's do a crazier font. What's like a wacky one? Maybe Old English? Okay, let's do Old English. That'll be weird. I don't know how well this will work, but when it comes to the text object here, we can, we can make it two-dimensional just by giving it a depth of 0. Now, that's not just scrunching it down. This is essentially only returning the cap. It's only returning one of the caps, so there's no redundant geometry. So just keep that in mind. So, is there a bold? No. So, let's make a slicer. Extension slicer. And feed this in. Hide the original. And rotate to whatever angle. And let's auto scale. Bink. And now it's capturing the entire thing. And I add a whole bunch of slices. I gotta add as many of those as I want. Well, first of all, you get this really cool stripey look. So right out of the gate, that's kind of neat. But let's make there be significantly less. This font might be too detailed for this to work very well. Actually, let's simplify. I want to zoom up on it more, and this border is too wide. So RKT again. Cool. And again, auto scale. Okay, so now we've got an RKT. Let's put that into another sweep and open the spline and then feed back in that end side. But this time, well, actually, even that looks kind of neat. Like, that's weird and abstract, but take that and shrink it down. And it's like, okay, that looks kind of interesting. But then you take that and you drop it down to 4 sides exactly. And scale it down, and you start getting this kind of crazy crystal-like look. Yeah, this font's a little, I mean, I like the font, but there's a little bit of messiness to it. So I wouldn't mind something with some curviness, but yeah, maybe. So let's make there be fewer slices, and then a larger spline. And it's not a very readable font. What's a Lilo? Yeah, no, it's all right. It's not magical or anything, but anyway, I just love, yeah, it's a little more readable. So you can see as we scale that up, we can type in 1, 2, 3. You can see how you get these kind of crazy looking layouts on it. I really love some different thickness. I feel like there's maybe, I don't know what font it was, but I definitely had some I'd played with that seemed more forgiving than it's currently being. I kind of like that one. So you take something like this, and then I feed that result into a volume builder, feed that into a volume mesher, and we're going to go like way overboard here. I'm going to set this down to 0.5, and that's going to make this super sharp where all these kind of blend into each other, which by itself is kind of cool looking. But you see I went nuts, and there's so many subdivisions. But then we take that, and we feed in some deformation, which we've been doing a lot of in this video. Well, let's sneak in a plane effector. Once again, .deform. And I want to deform the points. I want to deform it not on Y, but on Z, -2, if it still works at this current object. And yeah, I can now drop that in as a deformer into the mesher, and it should just pinch everything down a little bit. But now let's feed in a random field, and we're going to start getting some crazy patterns on there. But depending on the pattern we feed in, we can use something rare like Poxo, and then we start getting like this really great dented metal look. And it's actually physically there in the geometry, and immediately I just love like this sharp look on everything, and makes it kind of look like this pitted metal. Lots of different fonts we could feed in there, obviously. I also like feeding in a bit of smoothing. So put in a smooth deformer beforehand, and no stiffness. We can do a couple extra iterations, just round that out a bit so those you can see you get that really nice blending. And if this is a little bit sharp, we can always add more detail to it, or I kind of like making a second smoothing, setting that down something real small like 1, and that will come after the plane deformer just to take a little bit of the edge off, just a bit. You put 1 or 2, and yeah, you end up with this type of look, which, I don't know, it's just really fun. I love this kind of crystalline look that would be somewhat difficult to do. Like, if you were to ask me how to make this, I'd be like, oh man, how would you even do that? And I just stumbled across this while I was working on some demo ideas, and it just popped up, and I was like, oh, that's pretty cool. I'm just trying some different fonts. Good old Times New Roman. That was kind of weird and wacky. And then different noise types are going to give you different effects. So changing that to good old Voronoi 3 gets you kind of this dented metal look. And some of these are very bubble-like. That one's a little bit dented still. Maybe Voronoi 1. Yeah, this one's kind of like bubbles. If you set this to negative, that one would actually go the best way. Let's go positive 2. Yeah, there you go. That's the hammered metal look. Like, oh, that's cool looking. But yeah, I just love this combination. And I would, obviously this would work on anything, but again, combines really well with Slicer. Let's see. Thank you so much for picking it up. Yeah, Real Pixel Phil is asking about being able to feed it Alembic or a Redshift proxy. I don't know about Redshift proxies. I don't think I've ever used one, but the Alembic totally works. I closed it down, but the let me see if I've got that Alembic file. I seem to have navigated away from the folder, but I do have it here. Yeah. So yeah, we had the this Alembic file from an explosion, and that works perfectly fine. I'll just put it back in again because that's really fun. So does anybody have any final questions for me before we wrap this up? And I will once again put the discount code because it's your only chance to get this much money off of the launch. So let's hide that object, geometry, return as extruded, full percentage, do a little bit of smoothing, and a shablam. That's so much fun. Man, those are cool. The Salam, welcome. You're here at the very, very end of the stream. I'm just going to grab these links one last time. So, for about the next 5 minutes, you can get the largest discount off of Rocket Lasso's newest plugin, Slicer. And right after the stream, then that is going to be gone forever. But if you are supporting on Patreon, then not only do you get early access to videos and scene files from live streams, but there's also special discounts for people supporting on Patreon. If you support on Patreon at the $10 level, you'll get an $11 coupon, and that doesn't expire when the sale goes down. If you're supporting at $20 level, you get a $21 coupon. If you support at the $51, or if you support at $50, you'll get a $51 coupon. And you get access to all the scene files and bonus streams and everything there too. So that's another great way of supporting Rocket Lasso if you were so inclined. So yeah, exactly. So as long as you feed in geometry, then it's going to be able to cut it. It's seeing polygons is what it's being fed. So lots of fun, crazy combinations there. So yeah, it's super fun to put this one together. We've now got the trilogy of plugins. Let me switch this to this layout so you can see. Yeah, we've got Ricochet, Mesh to Spline, and now we have Slicer, and then soon we'll have the utility splines coming out. That'll be the next one, but probably not until after October is my current plan. So we'll have to see how that is. Art, thank you so much for supporting. Jed, Flavio, welcome. Oh, and thank you for picking it up. Yeah, thanks everybody. It's a huge thing. It makes me really happy to be able to finally share some of these with the world. We've been working on some of these for a long time. These some of these concepts were when we first started the company, and we just been kind of working our way through. One of the original ideas was we were making a giant pack of splines. We were making a whole collection of them. And because we kept on working on all of them at the same time, we weren't ever shipping anything. We've been working on them for years, and we're like, okay, we got to start just shipping these and like wrapping some of them up. So we're like, we're never going to ship them if we don't break them apart. Eventually, there'll probably be some sort of bundle or like a complete the bundle type of option, but mechanically, I'm not sure how to build that. I'm not a web person. But very exciting to get all of these out there in the world and see people make some cool animations with them. So let's see if there's any last questions. Yeah, thanks TJ, who has all 3 of the plugins. And yeah, I can't wait until the utilities are out there as well. The utility splines are not going to be like as flashy or sexy as these, but they're functional. They unlock functionality, which is going to be really important. Let's see, I'm going to play the commercial one last time, and then I'll check if there's any questions after that, and then we will be wrapped up. So be right back. Okay, that wraps this up. The code is only going to work for the next couple minutes, so if you want to go pick it up, make sure you go and do that right now. Otherwise, I'll see you next week for a regular live stream, and I'm looking forward to getting some tutorials out there. Don't know when it will be, but I've already started putting together a tips and tricks video, and I know everybody always really likes those. So that should be, you know, keep an eye out for that for whenever it comes out. But it's really hard to build those videos to come up with ideas I think are unique and helpful and things that people probably don't know about. So I put a lot of effort into those. But anyway, thank you so much for checking out Slicer. I'll see you in the next stream or the next tutorial or wherever that might be. Make sure you're following Rocket Lasso. There's links below for all the different social media platforms, and that'll do it. Bye-bye, everybody.